I think Ethan genuinely lied about reading the book. How could you possibly misinterpret this? No, of course he didn't read the book. What are you, stupid? No. He got someone in his Discord server that is like all of the loner box and bad empanada haters support group Discord server to basically feed him certain lines. He clip-chimped everything. He clip-chimped Nelson Mandela. Some of the things that he actually clipped out of context, I was very familiar with. I want to watch this.
I was in Ethan Klein's and Hasan Piker's debate. Ethan played a clip of Hasan reacting to a video of mine in which I refuted Ethan's dishonesty and omission surrounding the Nakba. We'll get back to this, but let's just say there's a reason why Ethan cut my clip off where he did. I'm going to be making this quick and hopefully short video to disprove Ethan's mischaracterizations of the Nakba and the events that contextualize it, his dishonest representation of—
It's not a skip. This has nothing to do with Ethan and everything to do with a major point of contention about the Nakba and the double Nakba theory.
Iraqi-Israeli historian Avi Shleim and his book
From friend of the show,
and to
Overzealots.
contend with the blatant Ethan displayed during that segment. I'm not going to get into iDubbbz's content cop or the whole swastika sword that is and isn't a swastika mess.
It's not a swastika, and you know it's not a swastika.
I mean, it literally is a swastika.
Why are you soy liberal chatters afraid of Decline and the Raider? They're understandably f***ing annoyed listening to Ethan Klein over and over again and seeing his face over and over again. I get why.
Made this claim in his content nuke.
After all, Israel is a country of refugees. If the Jews didn't come from Europe after the Holocaust, they came from the surrounding Arab countries that expelled them in massive amounts.
I have family who fought in Yemen, seen the sites firsthand, been on the ground myself. Even they dislike the Houthis and will fight them. But they can agree with you, myself included, about what you said about the Houthis. Appreciate you for the honesty. Yeah, I know people from Yemen. They're not Shia. They're not exactly fond of the Houthis. Their family members might have even fought the Houthis at a certain point. There's a reason why Yemen is united on this. The only guy who doesn't agree with me that's from Yemen is that one guy who lives in Israel now. What is it? Luai Ahmed or whatever. Who, of course, Ethan posted about because he loves a good token. Or Sweden.
Following the 1948 war. In fact, there was more Jews displaced than Palestinians during the Nakba. 1 million Jews.
And decided to stand by it during his debate with Hasan.
You said, in the context puke, you said, this was the worst thing I did, so let me play it, okay? And then we can discuss. In fact, there was more Jews displaced than Palestinians.
This was one of the worst pieces of misinformation I've seen in the context puke, for the record. It was crazy.
This specific...
So Mike, again, nicely done. Let this guy hold your hand and formulate your opinions, but he's not here to help you, okay? So you tell me what was wrong with what was misinformation about saying that 900,000 Jews were displaced?
He presents these two distinct situations, the cleansing of Palestinians and the displacement of Arab Jews, as if they're morally symmetrical, when they're not. And to support that argument, he cites the work of Avi Shleim, specifically Shleim's book, 3 Worlds. Ethan carefully frames his question to Hasan by asking,
what was misinformation about saying that 900,000 Jews were displaced?
But don't be misled by that framing. It's true that around 850,000 Jews left MENA countries for Israel, but the way Ethan poses that question implies a false equivalence, as if this were a mere case.
Which, by the way, I told him over and over again, but it was impossible for him or his audience to comprehend this. And the reason why it was impossible for him or his audience to comprehend this is because they also believe the exact same thing that Ethan believes, which is that Arabs are a f***ing monolith. And that all of these other countries, regardless of who was controlling those nations at the time, half of the countries that he literally points to were under colonial rulership. All of those countries were actually developing anti-Semitic tendencies and doing pogroms to Jews, and they were all united because they were all Arabs, the fucking Arabs, as Ethan said. And that's the problem. Neither the Jews nor the Arabs, whether they are Arab Jews or Arab Christians or Arab Muslims, are not fucking monolithic. You cannot attribute the crimes, for example, of Semitic, anti-Semitic hate crimes, let's say, that took place on and off in a place like Algeria when it was literally under colonial occupation and completely under the control of France, okay? Vichy France at first as well, to and attribute the lack of interest in like dealing with that, even though in Algeria there's also a second there's a second issue there as well, because a lot of the Algerian Jews were granted French citizenship, and therefore were collaborators with the French colonial occupation as well. And in the aftermath of this successful revolution there, they were granted Algerian citizenship, but they chose to move to France. They volunteered to move to France, for example. Saying that that is like relevant to the Palestinian plight in this regard is fucking ridiculous. It's no more ridiculous than saying that Palestinians have to die right now because Germany did the Holocaust.
Of mutual displacement. In reality, the forces behind the migration of Arab Jews were far more complex and included significant Zionist influence. In some cases, that included false flag bombing campaigns aimed at Jewish targets committed by the Zionist underground and blamed on local Arab communities to facilitate the immigration of Jews to Israel. The newly founded Israeli state was desperate to boost its Jewish population and secure a demographic majority, even though Arab Jews faced systemic racism from their European counterparts once they arrived. Meanwhile, these immigrants were often settled in Palestinian homes on expropriated land, while Palestinians themselves were ethnically cleansed, killed, or forced into exile. Not to mention, the migration of Jews to Palestine started well before 1948 and took place over the course of many, many years. That's not a mirror image, that's a power imbalance that can't be justified under any circumstances. And you know who agrees with my assessment? Avi Shlaim, the guy Ethan is mischaracterizing. Shlaim literally makes that point in his book, 3 Worlds. Klein even condescendingly asks Hasan if he's ever read the book, to which Hasan replies that he hasn't, but he's read Shlaim's other works.
3 Worlds. Have you read that book?
No, I have not read 3 Worlds.
Okay, well, you're using a lot of source from it. It's a book that he wrote about his migration.
It's not the only book he wrote about this. But go on.
Have you read any of the other ones?
Yes.
Really? Which ones?
The book that I'm referencing is from the Iron Wall.
Then Ethan goes on to heavily imply that he himself has either read the book or is very familiar with its contents.
3 Worlds, okay? He writes about his time in Iraq. He writes about his time in Israel. He writes about his time in the UK.
However, the events that follow prove that Ethan has no clue what Avi Shlaim's thesis is, nor has he actually read the book. Ethan seems to believe that Avi Shlaim, an anti-Zionist Arab Jew who supports a one-state solution, agrees with him that the exodus of Jews from Iraq and other MENA countries was morally...
Guys, like even the conversation around sexual violence that took place post October 7 or during October 7, where his initial point is like there's mass rapes led by Hamas. That's obviously not the case. That did not happen. There's no evidence for it. He was desperately trying to fire off a powerful clip where he could call me a fucking rape denier. And he couldn't even get that clip that he wanted. So his audience basically just kept repeating that point over and over again. And then it basically fell on fucking deaf ears, especially because Ethan shortly thereafter openly admitted that he was fucking lying about my position. He wasn't interested in actually winning that conversation at all, or even understanding my position at all. He was simply there to try to get a clip, any clip he can, to make me look bad after the fact that he could just like blast everywhere. But because he was not able to do so over the course of basically a 5-hour and 30-minute conversation, all of his gotchas fell flat. And what most people remembered is him just, actively agreeing with me over and over and over again. That's why they keep doing the picture it didn't happen shit. Like, that wasn't my point at all.
Comparable to the Nakba and simply caused by Arab racism and ideological anti-Semitism, but Shlaim actually argues the opposite. In 3 Worlds, he contends that ideological anti-Semitism was a European malady that later infected the Near East. He attributes the hostility toward Jews in Iraq and other MENA countries to the political fallout from European colonialism, the Zionist project, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, not to some ingrained ideological Arab anti-Semitism. Iraq, after all, had a long-standing, well-integrated Jewish community. As I said, Ethan opens this segment by downplaying the Nakba and conflating it with the Jewish exodus from MENA countries. He cites Shlaim to justify this moral flattening, but if he'd just let my video play for a few seconds longer, he'd have seen this direct quote from 3 Worlds, the very book he claims to be familiar with. I want to quote Avi Shlaim once more in regard to this claim. Zionists are driven by the propaganda need to portray the Jews as the victims of endemic Arab persecution, a portrayal that is then used to justify Israel's own atrocious treatment of the Palestinians. A rich, fascinating, and multi-dimensional history is thus reduced to a quest for ammunition to use in the ongoing war against the Palestinians. This trend reached its climax with the manufacture of the narrative of the Jewish Nakba. According to this narrative, the forced exodus of 850,000 Jews from Arab countries after 1948 amounted to a catastrophe, a Jewish Nakba, at least on par with, if not more devastating in its consequences than the Palestinian Nakba. Variously called the Forgotten Exodus, the Forced Exodus, or the Double Exodus.
I think Ethan genuinely lied about reading the book. How could you possibly misinterpret this? No, of course he didn't read the book. What are you, stupid? No. He got someone in his Discord server that is like all of the loner box and bad empanada haters support group Discord server to basically feed him certain lines. He clip-chimped everything. He clip-chimped Nelson Mandela. Some of the things that he actually clipped out of context I was very familiar with, so I was able to immediately go play out the rest of the fucking clip. You think he fucking sat down and read 3 worlds? If he did, he would be a fucking anti-Zionist. If he sat down and read a single fucking Avi Shlaim book, he would already have developed a much better understanding of Israel's inception and also the dynamic of Arab Jews in Israel as well, and how devastating that was, and how Israel is in its inception and in perpetuity, a white colonial, white supremacist settler colonial enterprise that heavily wanted to de-Arabize the region and westernize it. A big part of like even ruining the olive trees and rebuilding Israel in the image of the West that actually destroys the ecology of the region. That is part of the reason why the wildfires are so fucking devastating in Israel is directly because of this. They don't just like remove Arab words and slap on Hebrew to the neighborhoods. They also burn down the fucking villages in their entirety and engage in ecocide and plant European trees that dry up way faster than the natural olive trees would, the natural fauna would, which cause way more devastation when wildfires take place. It's a self-own every step of the way.
The purpose of this narrative is to create a false symmetry between the fate of 2 communities. This narrative is not history, it's the propaganda of the victors. Honest history has to acknowledge the part played by all the governments concerned in causing this man-made tragedy. The main difference is that the Palestinian refugees, for the most part, were ethnically cleansed by the Israeli armed forces, whereas Arab Jews, with a few exceptions, were given by the Arab governments the option of leaving or staying.
So right fauna or animals, sorry, flora. Fuck. ESL.
Shlaim argues against Ethan, and since this specific quote was inconvenient for Klein, he acted as though it didn't exist. I'm fairly certain he saw it because he played a clip of my video and then he quickly turned it off before the quote appeared on the screen.
No, I don't think he even saw that. I think you're giving him too much credit. I think someone else clipped it for him.
Also, it's literally only 17 pages into the book. Ethan, you only had to actually read 1 chapter. On the page prior, Avi says that the history of the Mizrahim has been deliberately distorted to serve Zionist propaganda, and Ethan is proving his point. Avi's central argument is that the Zion—
But I knew the basic thrust of the fucking book from, one, knowing about Avi's previous works, and also listening to him talk about the book because he's gone on a book tour since he released the book. So I know that his entire work revolves around undermining the point that Ethan was trying to make by fucking copying and pasting key parts of his fucking book. That was so crazy. That's why I literally said, dude, I'm going to have Avi Shlaim on to address some of the fucking claims that you made. We're still working on it, by the way. A lot of these older academics are much harder to get on the stream, including Elon Pape, who I talked to a while back to bring on the stream. And he said, oh, sorry, I'm booked until like October, which is insane. It's like, I love the guy, but goddamn, brother, till October, I don't know. I can't even book a guest for next week sometimes because things are moving so fast. He also probably has no fucking clue who I am, so that's part of the reason why.
The Zionist movement played a major role in fueling hostility toward Jewish communities in the MENA region, and that The subsequent migration of Jews to Israel should not be equated with the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, as doing so is historically inaccurate. Ethan pulls one quote from Schleim.
He said, "We did not leave Iraq because we were Zionists. We left because we were no longer safe."
And assumes that Schleim is on his side, but as we will see, this is not true. One thing I want to make abundantly clear before we go any further is that there absolutely was hostility toward Jews in many countries, especially post-1948.
Which is also not even a point that I contest. I know that that is the case. I have talked about this. I even asked Ethan, I was like, Ethan, have you ever heard me speak on this before? Because this is something that I also talk about. And he literally did not. He was like, he went silent for like 20 seconds. Because in that moment, he realized like, nope, he's only seen fucking clips that were sent to him of me. Clips to make it seem as though I'm denying the anti-Semitism that took place in these countries. Yeah, he went nonverbal for once.
It had little to do with ideological anti-Semitism in the genocidal way Europeans exhibited it, and nearly everything to do with geopolitical factors leading to intense nationalism. So although Jewish people may not have been forcefully expelled, and in some instances countries had laws on the books to prevent Jews from leaving, the conditions they were subjected to post-48 were horrible in a lot of instances. To use Iraq as an example, Jews were not forced out at gunpoint, as Ethan kind of implies.
Do you want to interview with Morena? Morena? Who in Morena?
And Jewish immigration was actually illegal at one point, but that doesn't change the fact that Jews were subjected to harsh and coercive conditions, fueled by Iraqi anger over the loss of Palestine, resentment towards Zionism, and the creation of a...
He brought up the bombing. It was like, you wouldn't understand the level of anti-Semitic danger. The Israelis only planted 3 of the 5 bombs. Yeah. If you are talking about my queen, my goat, okay? If you are talking about a potential interview with my queen, I will fucking fly down to Mexico right now. Do you understand? And no, I'm looking at my email. I don't fucking see it. So, by the way, this is yet another glaringly obvious example of it takes a fucking second to tell a lie and an hour to tell the truth or to correct said lie. It's like this conversation, this back and forth took place. I brought up virtually all the points that he's making. Obviously, it did not have the time and space or the additional knowledge of reading the book and citing directly from the book, as overzealous is doing here. But the conversation that took place in that back and forth with Ethan trying to steamroll with like clips directly out of context was not a productive one. It was probably one of the worst back and forths I had, even though it led to Ethan openly demonstrating his anti-Arab racism. Not that it fucking matters, because if everyone is anti-Arab racist, then he comes across as the normal one, and I come across as the manic one in the eyes of all of those people.
To external political elements in the MENA region. The depth of dishonesty in which Zionists are willing to sink to further their narrative is astonishing. Another example of this is how Ethan lies about the nature of the Iraqi bombings. When Ethan is discussing the false flag bombing campaigns in Iraq, mostly carried out by the Zionist underground to convince Iraqi Jews to flee the country, Ethan falsely and smugly claims that 100,000 Jews were already registered to leave Iraq before the bombs went off.
Before the bombs went off, 100,000 of the 125 Jews were already registered to leave. Do you want to explain that?
However, this is a blatant lie. Schleim explains how Zionist groups were formed for the expressed purpose to speed up Jewish emigration from Iraq because the turnout of Jews registering to leave Iraq was underwhelming. Following the passage of the denaturalization law, a small group consisting of Israeli envoys and local Zionists was formed to speed up the process of registration and emigration. The response of the Jewish community to the law was slow and hesitant. Only hundreds came forward in the initial phase. The Israeli authorities were seriously disappointed by this response. Consultations took place, and a decision was reached to take action to encourage Jews to give up their Iraqi citizenship. Israel needed the manpower both to build the country and to boost numbers in the army. At the same time, Israel's population was tiny, only 600,000 people, while surrounded by Arab countries with a combined population of tens of millions. There was an urgent need to increase numbers on the Jewish side of the demographic equation. It also says, Zionists exploited the bombing incidents, issuing warnings to the Jews to hurry up and leave the country before it was too late. It's also worth noting that just because someone registered to leave under the denaturalization law didn't mean they actually intended to. Quote, many of the Jews
or even that they were in fear of their lives, and that's the reason why they wanted to fucking do it either. Like, Some were, but that doesn't change that. That doesn't. You can't use that as a reasoning for across the board like double Nakba theories, which while also simultaneously using Avi Shleim's work to make this fucking incredulous claim when his work is entirely going against the double Nakba theory.
Who registered under the law had not finally made up.
It's like trying to fucking clip chimp Noam Chomsky to be like, the media actually voluntarily talks about the truth on purpose. Like that's the reason why they cover for the State Department, because they love to do it, and there's no invisible incentives built into the structure of the media at all. We've moved on from clip chimping Twitch streamers to clip chimping historians in a way where it's not not manufacturing consent. You're just manufacturing the truth. Famously, that's what Noam Chomsky was talking about.
Up their mind to surrender their Iraqi citizenship. They simply wanted to give themselves a way out should the situation become intolerable. So no, 100,000 Jews were not registered to leave before the bombs. I'm assuming Ethan probably read this Wikipedia article and came across this quote by Moshe Gat that says, just over 105,000 Jews had registered to leave by 8 March, and Ethan probably just stopped his research there. However, if you read the book in which Gat's quote comes from, Gat is referring to the year 1951. The bombing started on April 8th of 1950. Maybe Ethan just quote sniped from the wiki without proper research. That's the only way I can rationalize how he came.
Once again, this was not done by Ethan. You are assuming that he does any of this research. If he was capable of doing this research, he would have put up a stronger front. He was not. Someone else fed these quotes to him, and they also are not very good at doing research, but at least they're good at doing nefarious quote mining. Oftentimes, this is the Sex Pestany method. Not saying that it was Pestany that gave him these quotes, okay? Not saying that at all. But this is a method that he engages in where he relies on the other person not immediately being able to recall exactly what quote you have mined in an effort to present himself as the foremost authority on the subject matter. Reading doesn't help him at all. It doesn't aid him in his ultimate goal.
Came to that conclusion. Shleim's Three Worlds, the book Ethan was quoting from and lambasting Hasan for not reading, even refutes this claim by explaining that by the end of April 1950, the number of Jews who had registered to leave Iraq was 25,000. So Ethan was off by about 75,000. It's true that the bombings alone are not the sole reason as to why Jews wanted to flee Iraq. They were subjected to horrible conditions in many
I'm willing to bet he thought I would lie and say I read that book. Okay? And that would have probably been his like big reveal, like to make it seem like he actually read the book. But because I was honest, because I have no reason to fucking lie, and I told him I didn't read this book, it kind of fell short of what the intended goal was. That's what happened there. Of course, Ethan never read the book either, obviously, and I know more than he does about Avi Shleim's work, which is precisely why I was confident in pushing back against his claims, saying that he was, clip chimping Avi Shleim and actually undermining the overall point that he was trying to make. There were numerous occasions where he just he had like pre-established gotchas.
Instances. It's 100% accurate. Avi Shleim concedes that point, but the bombs did play a role. As Avi Shleim put it, there was a direct correlation between the bombings and the rise in the number of applicants to emigrate from Iraq. Shleim alleges that the majority of the bombings were committed by Zionist forces, and they, along with the rest of the bombings, were opportunistically utilized to serve Zionist propaganda. His entire point is that the State of Israel, which claimed to be a safe haven for Jews, was actively harming and harassing Jews across the region to serve the interests of their supremacist project. So when Ethan accuses Hasan of denying the flight of Arab Jews...
You deny the flight, you deny the trauma of Middle Eastern Jews.
I don't deny the flight,
You
Ethan.
absolutely
You don't
deny the
understand.
trauma.
You are attributing...
Ethan doesn't understand that Hasan is not denying anything. He's simply pointing out how the flight of Arab Jews ought not be used to offset or diminish the severity of the Nakba, which happens to be Avi Shleim's assessment as well. Now, if you want to...
Yeah, like one is a planned exterminationist campaign, okay, carefully crafted with numerous atrocities, and the other is a reaction to that planned extermination campaign from other wholly irrelevant groups, okay? entirely irrelevant groups, it's not the same at all. Like the Palestinians weren't in communications with like the Algerian Arabs or people in Morocco or people in fucking Yemen or any number of different places that Ethan points to, or in Iraq, right? The Palestinian Arabs were not like talking to the Iraqi Arabs and being like, yo, you got to kick these Jews out. You got to kill them. Let's all do it together. Like, that's not how this worked. If it was a direct analog, if it was actually something that you could use in comparison, there would have to be a direct line of communication and a planned extermination of Jews or ethnic cleansing campaign of Jews that the entire Arab League got together and engaged in. This reaction was not systematic ethnic cleansing in the same way that Planned Dalit was. The Mena Aliyah is not comparable to the Nakba. It reminds me of the double genocide theory in the USSR and Nazi Germany. No, that's exactly what I said. That's what I said after my review of the debate. It's the same as the double genocide theory. That's exactly what it is. It's the double genocide theory that fucking Holocaust revisionists and shit love to use to make it to soften the impact of Nazi Germany's Holocaust, which was very quickly discredited by historians to begin with. But the idea that USSR and Nazi Germany both did their own versions of the genocide, which is the double genocide theory, and it's comparing apples to oranges, centralized atrocities against diffuse violence and poor conditions in an effort to make one side's atrocities look more palatable, look more normal in comparison. And if you actually extend it to its logical conclusion, you arrive inevitably at the opinion that, well, guess what? Way more people died under communism. The USSR killed 7 quintillion people, as opposed to the Nazis only killed like 15 million in the concentration camps. Obviously, the Nazis weren't the bad guys. That's the logical conclusion that you are trying to arrive at in a very sinister, cynical way, in a place where it's like illegal to fucking say such things. That is the whole purpose of the double genocide theory. It's also hilarious because people use that to this day.
Argue that Schleim is wrong or his historiography is flawed, that's another conversation. But we're talking about Schleim because Ethan was the one using his book as an authoritative account. Even though Hasan didn't include all of what I just said in this video during his debate, and frankly, Ethan probably wouldn't have been receptive to it at that moment, Hasan's argument that Iraqis are not Palestinians
They're no longer safe.
Iraqis are not Palestinian!
and therefore Palestinians shouldn't be punished for actions taken in Iraq was the appropriate argument to make, in my opinion. Nothing that happened to Jewish people across the MENA region justifies what happened to Palestinians. It doesn't justify the fact that Palestinians were made refugees while Jews from the MENA region were able to settle in Palestine and expropriate Palestinian property. When Ethan reduces Iraqis, Morocco...
Of course, for the record, the double Nakba theory works if you're a Zionist, because what is the like major atrocity that took place that justifies the inception of the Israeli state as a Jewish nation state for Zionists? It's the Holocaust, right? So it's like whenever something horrible has happened to Jewish people, that's the reason why we have to fucking do this exterminationist policy and maintain a demographic majority Jewish ethno state in an area that does not belong to us is the underpinning of Zionism. But the only way that Ethan gets away with this double Nakba theory, as opposed to like being able to say that for the Holocaust, is because while people understand the Holocaust is a singular event, most people don't understand the Nakba. Most people don't know what that is, okay? Or even those who do know have only been taught that it was a war and that Israel was just doing shit that you do in a fucking war, right? It was just war shit, and the victims were also Arabs, and therefore, obviously, who gives a fuck? Whereas in his eyes, you can't justify that to the you can't justify the Holocaust is the reason why Israel had to exist to like average people, especially at this point, because they'd be like, okay, but the Germans have nothing to do with the Palestinians. But you can at least make it seem like the Arabs and the response to the Nakba, or the pan-Arabic nationalism that took hold in the entire region as these countries were being developed and statehood was being re-examined for the first time in a post-colonial way in these countries, you can at least sweep the entirety of the region under the brush of Arabs to say, well, Palestinians are Arabs and so are these fucking guys. You're relying a lot on people's lack of knowledge, and also you're relying on their bigotry. This is the underpinning of reactionary propaganda. This is precisely why I always say Ben Shapiro has a much easier go at it to fucking make an argument by just simply pointing the shit and going, it's common sense. It's just common sense, because all you need to do is lean on pre-existing biases that people have. This is why leftists always are on a back foot, because we do not have, most people don't have this accurate understanding of the shared history that we live in. And therefore, you have to literally, one, fight for the humanity of Palestinians, to establish the humanity of Palestinians, to develop an accurate assessment of historical events at a time when the other person is basically relying on bigotry that everyone shares, okay? And you have to be able to do so in a way that is charismatic and not convoluted, and also will penetrate the consciousness of a lot of people who have been primed to fucking assume that all Arabs are a monolith and scary and Muslim and barbaric. Not to say that because it's difficult, you shouldn't try, but, just explaining to you the structural hurdles of leftist thought and leftist debate in general.
Americans, Egyptians, Palestinians, and others into a single monolith, calling them simply
fucking Arabs, anti-Semitic
There you
Arabs.
go.
He tacitly justifies the crimes committed against Palestinians by lumping them in with other groups and making them pay for the wrongdoings of others. This is also a tactic used by the Zionist project to avoid responsibility for compensating Palestinians for the property they lost and are still owed. Ethan actually does this exact thing in the debate. He equates the loss of Jewish property across the region to the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and the expropriation of their property.
How would they go back and reclaim their lost assets, their lost property?
Even though the ethnic cleansing of Palestine had already begun well before the Nakba. Quote, Israel came under strong international pressure to allow the 750,000 Palestinians who became refugees in 1948 either to return to their homes or to receive compensation. Israel flatly rejected the right of return. This left the alternative of compensation, but this too is...
The reason why they were reluctant to concede on compensation was specifically because this would require them to take recognition, ownership over the Nakba, and that would yield additional legal complications down the line.
Israel was extremely reluctant to concede. In this context, the idea arose of offsetting the property left behind by the Palestinian refugees against the property of Iraqi Jews. Again, Arab Jews got Palestinian land and property. Palestinians got ethnically cleansed. It is not the same. Also, it's worth mentioning that many of these MENA countries were under European colonial rule during this time. The fact that Ethan actually tries to make this double exodus Jewish Nakba point in both his content nuke and in his debate with Hasan.
You brought that up deliberately to say more Jews were displaced than Palestinians
I think that's
were.
an interesting fact that you clearly don't fucking ever want to mention, because
Why
it
would
really
you bring up
messes
that
up your
fact?
beautiful little narrative.
All while citing Avi Shlaim, who openly detests this conflation, is a testament to either Ethan's stupidity or his dishonesty. It's important to understand that reducing this issue down to mere Arab anti-Semitism overlooks the actions of all the actors involved and flattens the complexity of the situation in a way that plays a role in justifying what happened to the Palestinians. To show you once more what Shlaim said about conflating the Jewish plight with the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the purpose of this narrative is to create a false symmetry between the fate of two communities. This narrative is not history, it is the propaganda of the victors. The main difference is that the Palestinian refugees, for the most part, were ethnically cleansed by the Israeli armed forces, whereas the Arab Jews, with a few exceptions, were given by the Arab governments the option of leaving or staying. Poor form of Ethan to skip past this while bastardizing Avi Shlaim's book. I don't think Avi would approve of this conflation while also claiming that the Arabs were responsible for creating Zionists.
The Arabs created a million Zionists because they're anti-Semitic.
In reality, the Zionist project, underway since the 1800s, was one of the factors that contributed to the rise of pan-Arab nationalism, not the other way around. Again, my point here is not that there was no hatred toward Jewish people in the MENA region. It is not that the Iraqi bombings were the sole reason for Jewish flight from Iraq. My point is simply to illustrate how Ethan...
By the way, the reason why I present the Iraqi bombings by the Zionist underground is not to say that that was the reason why all of the Jewish people chose to leave Iraq. The reason why I mention that, and is the same reason why Avi Shlaim mentions that, it is because it shows with conclusive evidence that a mass exodus of Jews from all of the MENA region was an absolute necessity, even though Israel reluctantly were bringing the Jews in because they were Arab Jews and were considered lesser than, what was Ben Gurion's initial take on it? Like, they were like the dust of the desert or something. But they needed more manpower to develop the ethno-state. They needed a larger population to maintain their demographic considerations, to maintain their demographic goals. The reason why I bring that up is to suggest that this was beneficial, if not sometimes directed by the Israeli government itself. That's it. And it's not the only instance where Israel actually did this from other countries in the MENA region as well.
Is an unreliable source on these topics. He cites Avi Shleim, invokes his authority, and then bastardizes his work so thoroughly that he ends up arguing for the exact opposite of Shleim's thesis. The comparison between the Nakba and the Jewish flight to Israel is deeply flawed. The Zionist project had been underway for decades prior, and pan-Arab nationalism was largely a reaction to it, as well as to broader European meddling. Jews who fled MENA countries were able to settle in Palestine and expropriate Palestinian homes and property. Palestinians, on the other hand, were violently displaced, denied return, and are still denied that right to this day. These are asymmetrical situations, and trying to force a false equivalence between them amounts to Nakba denialism. Anyway, this shit is agonizing to go through, but before I end the video, I want to quickly move to another topic that Ethan and Hasan briefly touched on, the comparison between Israel-Palestine and apartheid South Africa. I don't want to get into the whole would Nelson Mandela support violent resistance debate. It feels kind of awkward and distracts from the more important point, which is the conditions in apartheid South Africa were significantly different from what we see in Palestine today. As Noam Chomsky argued, the conditions Palestinians are subjected to are worse and more violent than those imposed on the indigenous people of South Africa. The black population in South Africa was relied upon for labor, whereas the Palestinian population is treated by the Israeli state as something to be done away with. And if you don't want to accept that argument from Chomsky because he didn't live under apartheid, then take it from Desmond Tutu, the South African bishop who said that what Israel does to Palestinians is, in many instances, worse than what occurred in South Africa. The Bantustans weren't routinely bombed, nor were they systematically targeted by snipers. There was absolutely violence and horrific, unforgivable atrocities committed against the black population of South Africa, but they were still needed alive for labor. They didn't experience the kind of regular, indiscriminate assaults that Palestinians face today, the so-called mowing of the lawn. This difference alone makes the Nelson Mandela comparison inapplicable in my opinion. The conditions Palestinians are subjected to are far more violent, and as a result, the response is bound to be more violent as well. It's an unfortunate reality, but the blame ultimately lies with the occupying force. Those who maintain apartheid structures and uphold an oppressive system are responsible for the violence that system produces. As Frantz Fanon wrote in the opening line of The Wretched of the Earth, decolonization is always a violent event. Anyway, I am done talking about Ethan Klein unless he responds to one of my videos. Funnily enough, the only one who responded to the last one was the fucking cartoon guy. So I mean, good on him.